Okay, hello and welcome, everybody. This is the Green Burial Council's public webinar, Caring for Our Dead, the Home Funeral to Green Burial Continuum. So, did you know that in most states, no one is required to purchase the services of a funeral director or funeral home? Many people don't know the rights of families to care for their own dead, what's often called a home funeral. The continuum of family-directed funeral care options are often a good match for those wanting a green burial. In this presentation, you will learn about families' rights and responsibilities when death occurs, what's meant by a home funeral, and how families can benefit from more hands-on engagement with after-death care, the barriers posed by misinformation, conventional wisdom, and default practices among helping professionals, simple techniques for empowering families with non-commercial consumer information, and how green burial providers can facilitate arrangements with families serving as their own funeral director. My name is Stephanie Drazen, and I sit on the board of directors at the Green Burial Council. We are a nonprofit that both does education and outreach in support of green burial, and we also certify cemeteries, funeral homes, and funeral products for green burial. However, the presenters in this presentation are going to be both Jody Buller and Holly Pruitt. Jody Buller is the Sexton and Cemetery Director for the White Eagle Memorial Preserve at Econe Ranch, a conservation burial ground in rural South Central Washington State established in 2008. She has been helping families and communities to bury their dead over 10 years and is a founding board member of the Conservation Burial Alliance. Holly Pruitt is a certified life cycle celebrant and home funeral guide who has provided community death education and consulting services for more than a decade. She has completed professional end-of-life doula training with the Peaceful Presence Project, studied for 8 years with Stephen Jenkinson's Orphan Wisdom School, and is certified in thanatology by the Association for Death Education and Counseling. Founder of PDX Death Cafe and the Death Talk Project, Holly led Talking About Dying sessions for Oregon Humanities for 3 years. Holly and Jody co-led the groundbreaking 2015 500-person educational conference Death OK, and in 2019 co-created the Oregon Funeral Resources and Education, a free, non-commercial public information site followed by their companion site, Washington Funeral Resources and Education. They have co-presented workshops on green burial and home funerals in a number of settings, and we are very excited to have them with us here today. A couple quick housekeeping things before we let them launch into their presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and drop those in the chat. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, we will go ahead and read through some of those for Holly and Jody. I believe that is everything. So with that, I will turn it over to Holly and Jody.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and also to Ryan behind the scenes in the Green Burial Council for hosting us. Why don't we go to the next slide? I also want to thank all of you for tuning in. It's great to see so much interest, and we can't see all of your faces, of course, but it's really good to have you joining us. So Jody and I kept the design of our presentation pretty simple. We're going to cover the what, why, and how. I'm going to share some how-to information on the general level, and then Jody is going to get into more detail about the home funeral relationship to green burial, that full continuum. I do want to warn you, I have an unfortunately timed head cold, and so if you see me mute suddenly and go off screen, and so I'm not subjecting you to a coughing fit, and Jody will step up. We are going to highlight, of course, where you can find more information because we're only going to be able to scratch the surface of this topic today, and we hope you're going to want to learn more. So we're going to start by sharing just a little bit of what brought each of us to this work. Next slide. Thank you.
Oh, yes. So These are some of the people who helped to guide me on the somewhat long and winding road into cemetery caretaking. The fella down on the bottom right, his name is Tim, and he was my partner in my early 30s, and I walked with him through the last 9 months of his life. He had one of the gnarly brain tumors. He was a permaculture gardener, and I feel like conservation burial is just such a beautiful way to honor all of the things that he taught me. The fella in the center is Ray Mitchell, and he's holding a biodiesel container. He was an early adapter and kind of um, a visionary in his own way. He helped found Econey Ranch, which is where White Eagle Memorial Preserve is located, and his fairly sudden death in 2007 was the impetus to form White Eagle. So we wouldn't be here without this man's vision and the vision of the people who wanted to honor him by burying him on the land that he worked so hard to steward. And then the lovely lady on the left is my grandma Happy. Gladys is her name, but she went by Happy her entire life. And it was her death in 2011 which really uh, brought me consciously into an understanding that I needed to know more about death and dying and repair or reconnect some of those threads that were missing in my family trajectory. So that was I after her death, I said maybe when I'm an elder, I'll become a hospice volunteer or something along
Mm.
those lines. And then just months later, received an invitation to apply for the White Eagle position. So thank you, Grandma Hap, from up in the ethers, wherever you are. It's
Yeah.
been a really beautiful and potent 10 years, and I'm
Mm.
grateful to all of these humans who made it possible.
Yeah. Well, I'll add my thanks to Tim and Ray and Happy for bringing you, Jody, into this work and into my life. And on the next slide, I will introduce you to my father. It was my first major initiation into death care came when my father was diagnosed with another one of those gnarly brain tumors when he was 63. And I was his part-time caregiver during the 18 months from diagnosis to death. But after his final exhale, he died at home in bed under hospice care. He was zipped into a body bag within the next hour and taken away for direct cremation. There was no funeral or memorial of any kind. I was given a yogurt container with a portion of his ashes a few months later, along with some of his personal effects and his veterans flag that my stepmother had ordered for me. Figuring out some kind of grief ritual of my own was part of what led me into my vocation as a funeral celebrant. But it was actually the Green Burial Council that made the connection for me. It was about 10 years after my dad's death, and a friend read an article in People magazine about Ramsey Creek Conservation Burial Ground in South Carolina, which describes itself as the first. And we're here in Portland, Oregon. And my friend said, if this is happening in South Carolina and it's in People magazine, why is it not happening here in the green capital that Portland likes to think of itself as? So we started a self-study program about green burial and contacted the relatively newly formed Green Burial Council, who introduced me to another advocate in Portland, and she'd been trained as a life cycle celebrant. And I said, what's that? It was based on a model of civil celebrancy established by the Australian government in the 70s to create a profession outside of the clergy and the judiciary that could marry and bury people. And that led me into training as a home funeral guide and later as an end-of-life doula, and to many years of community education in partnership with Riverview Cemetery in Portland and White Eagle. We can go to the next slide, please. Through all of the work over these last dozen years, I've been struck by how actually unique it is to the dominant culture of North America that so many of us no longer know how to care for our dead, that so many die, like my father, with no memorial or grief or remembrance ritual of any kind. Historically, we know that care for the dead has always been handled by family and community, with archaeological evidence of such rituals going back to our Neanderthal cousins. And it's important to acknowledge at the top of our talk tonight that for some, religious and cultural rituals and practices continue to provide guidance and support and meaning when death occurs. We particularly honor and respect the Black funeral tradition of homegoings, religious burial societies, and care groups, such as those in Jewish, Muslim, and Quaker communities, long-held practices of Indigenous communities, and the death care and the bereavement traditions that are sustained in immigrant and refugee communities. For communities that are subjected to systemic racism, caring properly for the dead is a deeply important form of community respect and cultural survival. And LGBTQ people as well have created our own community-specific practices out of necessity and by design. The queer community and folks who are houseless, among others, have also taught us that family is not limited to biological family, but includes chosen family. And so when we use the word family in our presentation, we're using that expansive definition. So all of the traditions that I've just referenced might not be called home funerals, but they share many of the attributes of what we're here to discuss. So let's go to the next slide to say, what are some of these attributes? What is a home funeral? We can go to the next slide. If we could see all of each other in a big Zoom room, I'd be asking for a show of hands, but instead you can reflect for yourself. Have you ever been a part of bathing or dressing a deceased body? Perhaps anointing with oils? Have you ever spent time with a deceased body that is sometimes called a wake or a vigil or a viewing? Have you ever kept, I see a hand waving, thank you. A few of the boxes that are visible. Have you ever kept the body of a deceased person at home for a period of time after death? Have you ever transported a deceased body? Have you made direct arrangements for final disposition, meaning burial or cremation or one of the emerging alternatives, without the use of a funeral home to make those arrangements? Or created a ceremony without a funeral home's assistance? And perhaps some of you have actually gotten into the bureaucratic details of death, the notification of death, the death certificate, actually filing those without a funeral director. And perhaps some of you have participated in something, attended something that's been called a home funeral, or that incorporates any of these aspects. So if your hand went up or you registered yes for any of this, then you already have a sense of some of what may be described as a home funeral. And go to the next slide. Now, I often describe, instead of using the term home funeral, I talk about from death to disposition, everything that happens between the final exhale and when the body is legally disposed of, because the term home funeral can really conjure up very specific images for some people, maybe even a particular aesthetic. And so we like this much more broadly inclusive definition, that what we're describing as a home funeral is a non-commercial, family-centered response to death that involves the family, chosen family, and its social community in the care and preparation of the deceased for disposition, bathing, dressing, and or in carrying out related rituals and ceremonies, and or in the disposition itself. Notice all the and ors. Every box does not need to be checked here. This may occur entirely within the family home or not, but it's differentiated from the conventional or institutional funeral by an emphasis on minimal, non-invasive care and preparation of the deceased body. So no embalming, by reliance on the family's own social networks for assistance and support, and sometimes community care networks where those exist. And lastly, on the relative or total absence of commercial funeral providers in its proceedings. One more thing on the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. This is just another way of looking at it, So again, what does this include? Everything that we just did our kind of opening quiz on. These things can happen one-on-one. These things can happen with a group. This can be a group of people who've known each other for a long time. It can be people who come together specifically for the purpose of serving the dying and the dead after their deaths. In terms of filing the death certificate and obtaining a burial and transit permit, we'll talk about where that's legally available, but because of the prevalence of the electronic death registration system, it can be very, very hard to access the materials to actually do this. So we'll talk about this. But a home funeral might include any or all of these kinds of activities. So here I want to tell you one more caveat on the next slide. Many people confuse the idea of a home burial and a home funeral. And there are certainly some folks for whom that continuum is going to end with burying on their own property where that's legally available and where it's desired to them. But in even among many authorities, the two terms are conflated and have led in the home funeral education movement to literally headlines, these ladies are trying to bury grandma in the backyard. And they may or may not be trying to bury grandma in the backyard if they have the legal right to do that. Maybe they're going to. But this is, there's quite a bit of confusion about these two things. So let's go to the next slide. So we're going to share where you can find practical how-to information for each aspect of those tasks that we've just delineated. But the most important thing to know is your legal rights. Keeping or bringing a loved one home after death is legal in every single state. And there's some wonderful resources in Canada, death care communities in Canada. So I apologize for being US specific here. But in every single state, it is legal to bring a loved one home, to keep a loved one home after death. Now, in 40 out of 50 states, we are legally entitled to have our family member or a designated representative handle all of the tasks of a funeral director, everything we saw on these prior slides, as long as they're not paid to do so. If they're paid, then they're regulated. But if they're unpaid, in 40 out of 50 states, you are not required to hire a funeral director or a funeral home, which has got to be one of the best kept secrets in the world. But now we have 110 people who can help to debunk that. So let's go to the next slide. These are the 10 states that do require the use of a commercial funeral director for some aspects of after-death care. And this information is on the same resource page that we're going to refer to repeatedly and that we'll put into the chat later. So you can see it's not even uniform what the funeral director is required to do. So 10 states, you need to take a closer look, and the other 40 states, there are actually no legal restrictions on families in this regard. So let's zoom back out to the bigger picture on the next slide. It's helpful to think about three basic approaches, again, on this continuum. So at the bottom, kind of the conventional or commercial funeral. And by commercial, I don't mean to say anything crass, but I mean that you pay and hire people who are going to direct all aspects of what happens from the time of death to the final disposition. And at the top, is what might be called, again, the home funeral conceived and conducted by the family and their wider community. But the reality is for most of us, a blended approach is going to be what's most realistic, retaining control while only purchasing what's beneficial or necessary. And so a big value of doing this kind of educational presentation is to sort of peel back that veil from the mysterious time from death to disposition to understand all of what is involved, and then hiring for those pieces that you don't want to or can't handle yourself. So if we can go to the next slide, just going to share the story of my beautiful friend, Marcy, who lived with stage 4 ovarian cancer for 5 years, never any remission. And she said, if I'm going to have to be one of the first of my age peers to go, I want you all to learn everything about it along with me. And on the her 1 year cancerversary, the 1 year anniversary of her diagnosis, she wrote a letter to those she called her sisterhood. And she said, at the time of my death, involve my husband as best as he's able, but don't count on him. His job was going to be grieving husband. Our job was going to be carrying out her wishes. She specified that she wanted a green burial, and later she went to Riverview Cemetery with her dog, against the rules, in her flannel nightgown to pick out her grave site. She said, you all better come spend a lot of time here. And so one friend said, well, then there better be a bench, which her mother thankfully took care of. Riverview is a hybrid green burial cemetery. And then she charged her sister with creating her burial shroud and her brother with her lowering board to lower her body into the grave, which he milled from a tree on his own property. And after her final exhale, we gathered and moved her body onto a massage table in her craft room and laid her out with all of the items that she had specified and that we knew she was going to want. And the next day, people came by in ones and twos and threes and spent time with her body. And when everybody had come by and gathered and told stories in the living room adjacent, at the end of that day, we wrapped her body in the shroud with the unfinished heart that her sister had left that you can see at the bottom. Now, we had already obtained the packet from the state vital stats office so that we could file her death certificate paperwork on our own. But there was so much else for us to be involved with in terms of care of family, community, preparing for her burial, that her husband made the call, let's just have the funeral home that's associated with the cemetery just go ahead and take care of that for us. Additionally, he elected to have them do the transportation because they had a very steep property with a lot of stairs. Everybody was exhausted, and he thought, we could do it, but really, let's just let some big, strong guys come in and take care of it for us at this point. In the arrangements conference for her burial, which again, Riverview is a leader in urban natural burial. They knew that she was going to be doing it essentially by the book, but I checked in and I said, let's talk about the lowering. And they said, well, don't worry, the lowering device will be in place. Now, this is not a hydraulic lowering device, but a hand cranked. And I said, well, that's why I want to check in, because we actually wanted to hand lower Marcy. But it wouldn't have occurred to them to ask us that because it's so uncommon these days, especially in a hybrid cemetery, to have people actually physically do their own lowering. And we knew that Marcy's mother thought this whole green burial thing was a little bit strange. And so when she offered to hire a bagpiper to meet her sense of what she recognized in terms of a graveside service, that was another perfect way to incorporate a range of elements. Let's go to the next slide, please. So why would some folks choose a blended approach or, an entirely hands-on approach to these matters when there are paid professionals out there with expertise in taking care of this? The reason for every person, every family is going to be different. For some, it's a matter of cost, doing things as frugally as possible. Why pay somebody else to do something that you can take care of yourself? For others, it's reducing the carbon footprint and knowing that without all of the different add-ons that can easily start to happen with a funeral home, that have more control over doing things that are more aligned with their environmental values. Religious, cultural, or spiritual beliefs may be a factor, and in some traditions, the belief that the body shouldn't be moved for a period of time, sometimes 3 days in some belief systems, to avoid disrupting the soul's journey. For some, it's about continuity of relationship. You've been caring for the person through life, possibly through dying. Why would that end and turn the body over to strangers at that point? And for some, that continuity really serves the purpose of active grieving, of people coming together for communal mourning. When my father-in-law died in a residential hospice and his wife came, expecting to see him alive that day, having gotten the call that he had died, they said, "Wait here, please. We're not finished getting him ready." And by the time she came into the room, he was completely cleaned and bathed and holding a rose, a beautiful composition. She didn't have that chance to make the transition from the body that she recognized that was lying there dying to the corpse that was now there with a flower in his hand. And even though he had arranged for a direct cremation, we intervened and had the opportunity for her to do an additional viewing so that she could slow down that process and incorporate the reality of his death a little bit more. For some people, it's about maintaining control. And for others, there's simply a built-in regional or cultural preference for doing it yourself. A lot of farm and ranch families, for example, it's always the way they've taken care of it. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to
Yeah,
pause now and turn to Jody. We want to share just a few stories that bring this to life a little bit more.
yeah. Thanks, Holly. So this is a story you can find in 3 parts on the WashingtonFuneral.org website. It's Michaela's story. And Michaela was a college student in Seattle, Washington, and her mom, Zachara, wrote beautifully about the time in the hospital and the vigil and how to honor someone in a hospital and institutional setting, and also about the green burial that they had, the natural burial they had out at White Eagle. And then there's a section about the burial transit permit and how that particular piece of paperwork made uh made the process took the process out of her hands, I guess is how I would say it. The hospital would not release Michaela's body without one, and the funeral homes that Zachara was trying to contact in a fairly time precious manner. Their family has Islamic traditions and wanted to be able to bury Michaela within the day, the 24 hours that after she had died, and ended up needing to pay a funeral director $1,000 to drive 17 miles so that they could receive Michaela's body at an Islamic cultural center and then do the washing and the praying and the shrouding and then drive her out in their own vehicle to White Eagle for burial. But there was a fairly traumatic bureaucratic hiccup in that process. And I think that speaks to many of the bullet points on the previous slide. And Zachara is a beautiful writer, so I would very much recommend reading through that story. Holly, do you want to talk about the next slide?
Yeah, thanks, Jody.
Yeah.
So the Oregon Funeral Resources and Education website is dedicated to Max, another unanticipated death of a child. This is beautiful 4-year-old Max, who tragically drowned on an ice-covered pond on his family's ranch when the babysitter had her eyes on his younger brother. And after he was life-flighted to the nearest hospital and pronounced dead, his parents told the authorities that after the medical examiner had completed the investigation, which they knew was required with a child death, they wanted to take Max home where they would be with Max's younger brother and where they would bury him in the family cemetery on their ranch. And the medical examiner said, "I'm sorry, only tribal members can do that here." And then compounding their anguish, the funeral director, who they essentially felt forced to hire, who took custody of their son's body and put it into refrigeration, he was misinformed about home burial rules, and they had to involve a lawyer in order to get the release of their son's body to bring him home. But through Kelia's determination, they were able to give Max a beautiful home burial in a hand-built casket. And then on the 1-year anniversary, Kelia found me, and together we started mapping a pathway that could prevent this from happening to other families. And you can see that Kelia shares that she's compelled to tell this story, hoping with all her heart that this information about caring for your own dead can reach those who need to know it, so that others will get the chance that she was denied, to lay with your dearly departed's body in the privacy of your own home, keening until your voice is gone, spending those last hours with that body that you hugged and kissed, talked to, and laughed with. Next slide, please. David Noble, one of the education partners that Jody and I worked with, who'd been the executive director at Riverview, becoming a very strong both green burial and home funeral advocate at the end of his many decades career as a cemeterian and funeral director. He notes that until around 1900, when a death occurred, the tasks that are now performed by paid professionals were performed by the family. Most people today think that they're legally required to use a funeral home, which simply is not true in the vast majority of our states. More and more families desire hands-on involvement, but simply don't know how to go about doing so. So next slide, please. How do we rebuild this capacity and this knowledge? Through events like this, through community death care circles, and really at the highest level, what we need to encourage us to do is to prepare in advance, if possible, so that we know our rights, if nothing else. To think about, talk about, and possibly document what's important to you around that continuum of tasks that we just covered. What resources might you have that could be part of a more hands-on, less commercial approach, if that's desired? Really understanding that you have the right to slow the process down and to go with your gut feeling if something doesn't feel right. Kelia had that in the back of her mind. She thought, I read an article in Mother Earth News 10 years ago about this and thought I might need it someday for my parents, never thinking she would need it for her child. But in the moment, there was no way to confirm her gut instinct. And that's where common sense comes into, they got the lawyer involved. They knew that just because they were stopped at these different pieces of the process, that didn't mean that they couldn't do what they knew how to do, build that casket, and they knew how to bury their son. Let's go to the next slide. So knowing your rights. This is a screenshot from the website that Kelia and Jody and I put together based on the model created by Lee Webster for New Hampshire Funeral Resources and Education. Some of you know Lee. She was past president of Green Burial Council International and of the National Home Funeral Alliance, among many other leadership roles. You can see that there's detailed how-tos on every one of these pieces that we've talked about, along with a vast array of other information. And it's all state-specific for Oregon. You can see on the next slide that Jody and I worked with Lee to replicate the site for Washington, and Lee has been building out through Funeral Partnership a few other states as well. Let's go to the next slide and we'll show you where additionally there are some fantastic handbooks, guidebooks that provide information that is applicable no matter where you are. It's not state or province specific. The National Home Funeral Alliance has just put out a new guidebook, which is available from their website. And then Lee has rolled up many of her publications from over the years into the After Death Care Educator Handbook for those who will play a community education role. And that is available via Amazon or via your local booksellers. So let's go to the next slide. Before I hand off to Jody, I want to talk about one other aspect of being prepared, and that is that most folks don't realize that the other paperwork that you do towards being prepared for dying, a power of attorney, a designated representative, advance directive, those all expire at the time of death. So if you do want somebody other than the legally defined chain of command of next of kin to take care of your funeral arrangements, you need to do an advance appointment of the person who will handle the disposition of your remains. We did a blog post of this specific to what this means for the queer community on the Oregon site with a download of the Oregon form. But this is something that can be replicated on your own or to find the form for your own state. So let's go to the next slide. And Jody is going to start to share the cemetery sexton's perspective on what all of this can look like for green burial families, either using a funeral home or doing so without one. Jody?
Thanks, Holly. All right, next slide, please. So I'm going to start by introducing a little bit about this place, and then show you some lovely pictures along the way with a little bit of story in the mix. The photo on the left is in the green boxes, Sacred Earth Foundation lands. This is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that runs summer camps and land-based programs for kids and grown-ups, and then with the death of Ray Mitchell, who founded the place, 20 acres of wilderness cemetery, which is in the little white rectangle, kind of set at odds. It's adjacent to Rock Creek Canyon, and Rock Creek feeds into the Columbia River. This area is Kamithpa land, so Rock Creek Band, and their longhouse is down near where Rock Creek meets the Columbia. They're one of the 14 confederated tribes and bands of the Yakima Nation, and in the 80s, a lot of this land was getting sold to logging companies, and so one of Ray Mitchell's kind of primary visions and goals in life was to protect as much of this intact wilderness as possible. So this is now a 52-year-old back to the land experiment that turned into land conservation life work and summer camp, which does continue. It's been since 2007 when Ray died, that we've been continuing the work. And 20 acres of this 1,263 acre land stewardship organization is now White Eagle Memorial Preserve. And we are certified through the Green Burial Council as a conservation burial ground. One of the things that I find with natural burial, conservation burial, is that people are really drawn to it for shared ecological sort of value system. And the real potency of the work is in the direct engagement that families have with the burying of their person. And so that continuum of care for someone after they have died all the way into the earth is just, it feels very very aligned. And from my perspective, part of the reason I'm so glad the existence of these funeral resources and education websites is that I will talk to families who really want to do as much of this work themselves, and maybe cost is a factor, maybe it's a combination of cultural or religious or just common sense. It makes sense to do this, and so I was telling people that they could, but really not able to point to specific resources for folks to make those sometimes advocacy stands with their county clerk or the hospital. Or so that's been a piece of this work that I didn't necessarily anticipate at the beginning, but has really grown in scope and in importance. Next slide, please. So we laid a grid on 20 acres of land, and this painting on the left is kind of an artistic rendering of that. And this is one of the first things that I talk about with people who are coming out, kind of pre-planning, wanting to come and walk the woods and choose a potential site for themselves, is that we laid a grid over the forest, but what we're working with is the land. And so in any given section, and the red lines are site sections. It goes A through G and 1 through 12. And then the little blue lines are 20-foot by 20-foot squares. So we're practicing low density burial. But within any given 20 by 20 square in a forest, there may be a stand of oak trees or a downed pine tree. So what we are actually working with is the land. And this picture on the right is Kate. And Kate and Jay, her dear friend, came out a few years back to pick sites. And the copper and wood and rebar marker there is her like reservation marker. They came back out last summer. And this is more what it is actually like to pick a spot at White Eagle. I ask people to pick up a stick and put it in the direction they feel like they want to be facing, and find their own angle of repose, and just sort of can reconnect with the land itself. So I want to highlight that with natural burial and conservation burial in particular. There is the primary relationship is with the land. Next slide, please. And what we're hoping is that we're able to bury people in a way that does not overly impact land and eventually blends. So the slide on the left is my hot pink backpack, which I use when I'm taking pictures of a place for somebody who's maybe not able to come out in person and need a visual cue. The picture on the right is of a grave mound that has settled out over time and is kind of at rest, and you wouldn't necessarily notice it if you were walking through the woods. Many of the grave mounds at White Eagle are ringed in rocks or pine cones or sticks or other ways. And next slide, please. We do have marker stones for some of them. We ask that they be rock-shaped rocks. It's the primary. Sometimes people are bringing a rock from a place that is important to them. Sometimes we're using locally sourced stone. We're with most green burial or natural burial, we're going 3 to 4 feet deep in the earth, depending on if it's a casket or a shroud. If it's a casket, it's gonna be either made of unvarnished. This is a pine box with some butterflies engraved on it, or a willow woven basket or bamboo. There are many options that are emerging in the field. Often they are made by the family members themselves. And next slide, please. And that includes shrouds. Feel like shroud burial is really emerging as the kind of a softest way of reconnecting with the earth. So this is a shroud that one of our founding stewards, Chris, has made. She works with custom wishes, important quilts to a family or favorite colors. This photo on the right is a shroud burial within what's called a soul boat. The willow weaver who makes these baskets has been out to Ikonia a number of times. And in this case, the family had their loved one at a funeral home and went there the morning of his burial with armfuls of flowers and spent the morning preparing him and shrouding him and adorning him in color and beauty, and then drove him out to us in a private vehicle, and pretty much walked their way through the entire service themselves. I feel like often my role is to hold the space for what the family needs, whether they know yet what they need or not. So I'm just sort of trying to slow the process down and offer welcome and engagement at each step along the way. So who would like to help transfer this person onto the cart? We need 6 people. We have a home crew, but I think we would like for the family and community to be able to step in as often as possible along this process. Next slide, please. So that's another picture of the soul boat. That's Chris, the shroud maker in the orange, and our apprentice Aggie and Ashway. We have a home crew, and sometimes we do what are called direct burials, where it's just us. But I would say more often than not, the family is really making this choice because they want to be they want to do the ancient human duty of laying their loved one to rest in the earth. So this picture on the right is one of my sort of favorite moments. This woman's sister was up until the wee hours in the morning decorating their horse trailer. This is Leslie, who was showed horses. You can see her ribbons there on one of the hay bales. Her saddle was there, and this was her final road trip. And from here, we transferred her shrouded body into that pine casket you saw with the butterflies on it. And it was just such a very individual, personal, honoring process. And it was really, really potent for her sister to spend that time to do this kind of labor of love also. Next slide, please. That said, the picture on the left is a funeral director and an 88-year-old man, both from St. George, Utah, which is closest to Las Vegas. And David, the fella, had bought a site with us years back and did not expect to outlive his wife. And when his beloved died ahead of him, it was really important for him that she be buried next to where he would be. And that funeral director had been 43 years in funeral service and had never been to a green or a natural burial before, and was crying pretty much throughout the whole process. I think we changed his life in some beautiful way. But I bring this up because there are some incredible funeral directors out there, and the sort of binary of no, the industry is not the best is not true, I guess. I work with some really incredible natural burial friendly funeral homes and people who are drawn to this service in the same way that I feel drawn to this service. I also wanted to include this picture because of the chickens, because I feel like part of what people are engaging with, at least at White Eagle in particular, is that there are horses and there are chickens and sometimes there are kids at summer camp, and this like continuum of life and liveliness actually can hold all of the complicated and intense feelings around grief. I think wilderness can do that also. I had
Jody,
picked
I just
some.
want to interject with your comments about funeral directors. I think we were remiss in not having a bullet around planning ahead and kind of the big picture. That's a key part of planning ahead is developing a relationship, if you can, with funeral director or funeral home who can support the aspects that you want them involved in without necessarily charging a general services fee for a bunch of things that you don't want.
So much. If you have the luxury and the privilege of advanced planning, it can be really affirming to find connection with funeral directors and professionals, end of life doulas, all of these people who are in service in this way. And it can help you to clarify what you do and do not want. Like I think there's a lot to be said for that. Next slide, please. So this is a burial from last January, and I think in showing these pictures, I'm wanting to talk about how natural burial is a fairly simple process. You know, we are digging the graves by hand. We are arriving and walking out. We are lowering and we are closing the grave. And yet each burial that I have helped witness and host is so uniquely particular to the human being. And so this burial was for a musician, and his family pretty much held the entire process and sang his songs. And then this is a woman who is watering in, it's hard to see the teapot there, but she's watering in a native seed mix that we add onto the top of a burial mound. Then we mulch the top of that to try and kind of tuck the seeds in and protect against invasive species. Next slide, please. This is a photo from a grave digging work party, and this is another piece of all of this, like how we, when we are still alive, connect with our inevitable deaths and make that less scary and less taboo. And so this is one of our board members there on the left, and then a grad student from Washington State University. She's studying sort of the social anthropology aspects of death and dying, and she brought her dad out, and the two of them helped to dig this grave in preparation for winter at need burials. So we try to have a few graves that are prepared, because digging by hand does take days sometimes. But it's very life affirming, I feel like, to be able to connect with people around this fairly simple but really profound act of digging a grave. Next slide, please. So this is my morning practice on the day of a burial. I'm going into the garden, or I'm going into the forest and gathering, in this case, it was cabbage leaves and tomatoes and sunflowers and hops, and spending time graveside making beauty. Next slide, please. And this is our apprentice Aggie. She's doing some work at the bottom of the grave. I feel like this helps to ground and center and kind of prepare to welcome our newest ancestor into the earth. And next slide, please. And then this is also a practice for families to do in a way that they can engage. So this is the burial mound for a woman who was an avid gardener and lover of birds, and her family, her daughter went to the garden and gathered tubs of flowers, and the family took their time and were planting the flowers in the fresh earth of the grave mound, and making sort of a quilt of flowers to tuck her in. That's really, really beautiful. I feel like this aspect of making beauty is kind of crucial. So sometimes we'll see that with the ringing of stones or pine cones, or kids going out and finding bits of bright green lichen to place on the grave. It's a way of connecting our creative selves through this fairly intense emotional experience. Next slide, please. So here's how the cabbages and sunflowers turned out. This is Grace's place. This was a burial from this fall, and I'm including these slides as a placeholder of sorts in my mind to talk about the relationship that caregivers have with people who are in their end of life, and Grace's burial was attended primarily by her daughter, her daughter's partner, and their family of care, and the people who had spent the last 3 years with Grace on a daily basis, and how meaningful that is for the caregiver's role. We've talked about, Holly's talked about family and kind of that more expansive understanding of it. And I feel like when somebody's in a years long and extended dying time, the role of caregiving and of professional death support really draws family together from wider reaches. Next slide, please. So this is another example of a fella who had come out with his partner, and she'd found a spot in the fall. I talked about spring when the wildflowers were blooming, and she really wanted to be buried during the spring, and she died earlier than they were hoping, which is kind of a universal statement. But they had worked with a green burial friendly funeral home, Cornerstone, and so they were able to keep her body in shelter for the weeks that it took for the wildflowers to arrive. And then he had gone to a favorite park near their house and gathered a bunch of forsythia, and it was really important for him to come out in the morning ahead of the rest of the guests and spend some time graveside and be present and ground himself a little bit. Next slide, please. And so this is her people. That's her dad and her partner and some brothers, and the cart walking out to her grave place. I feel like the human scale aspect, the procession, that it takes a little while. This whole thing takes some time, and there's something, I think, like Holly was referring to, of shortly after her dad's death, and then he's gone, and like that abruptness. And I feel like one of the things that natural burial can do is layer back in a sense of spaciousness around this. We're not in a hurry. It takes the time it takes. Next slide, please. And this is the lowering. And I try to really pause before. This is a moment of truth during any burial process. People don't want to mess it up. They've never done this before. So just talk about using your legs and breathing. And next slide, please. And this is another one of those moments of truth. I will invite people to help with the closing of the grave, whether that's a symbolic shovel of earth or 37 shovels and breaking a sweat. And there's something intangible about working like this, I guess I would say, like really, but whether you're wearing the right shoes or not, putting your labor into the closing of a grave. So that's her dad handing her mom a shovel, and her mom did trade the flowers for the shovel. Just so, but there's this moment is that sort of, I feel like, captures that, like, I don't think I can do this, and then I have to do this, kind of what that shift is. Next slide, please. And then I think it's important to recognize that everybody is going to be working with their grief differently. And some people need to talk and tell all the stories they can think of about their person. And some people need quiet and alone time. And we're just trying to hold the space for all of those things. And I think that's true with time in the home and during a home funeral. Like, how do we make enough space to let everyone touch in to this process from where they are at? Next slide, please. And so part of the beauty of the work that I get to do is that there is a spacious wilderness that can hold the complexity of a lot of those griefs. And that's not true for everyone, and it doesn't have to be. I think you can apply all of these same kind of principles or ideas to disposition in many ways. It's just, can you make enough space within to allow, there's conversation around what a good death is, and I feel like if you can carve out places to engage, to step toward, it doesn't matter what those particulars are. It's that's where we begin to befriend death better. Next slide, please. Because that said, we are not in American culture very good friends with death, and there's a lot of professionals out there in the county clerk's offices, in hospitals, in some funeral homes that don't know enough. They don't know the legalities of things, or they don't know how to support families who are being the ones in the room to say, I need this. And so I think that's important to acknowledge, that we come up against misinformed or people who don't know. So this is outreach and education, which is back to pre-planning and the importance of looking into some of these things if you're drawn to them ahead of it being imminent. Holly, do you have further thoughts on that?
If we go to the next slide, this is one of the key pieces, I think, of misinformation. And we know there are a lot of questions that have been posed in the chat, but we just want to hit a few of these aspects of the advocacy that Jody mentioned and that Kelia is calling us to help prevent misinformation. So this is something available on Lee's New Hampshire Funeral Resources and Education site. Any cemeterian faces these questions about the safety of dead bodies. And there are state by state questions about how long a body can be kept at home, but typically what's referred to as a 24-hour rule, or things that so commonly are referenced even by folks in hospice, apply to paid professional licensed funeral service professionals. The requirements for refrigeration, the length of time pieces are good consumer protection measures. But most states are completely neutral as to what unpaid family service practitioners who are doing this on an unpaid basis for themselves can be doing. But let's go to the next slide just to kind of wrap up. And Jody, thank you so much for bringing us into the heart of your work. One of the other reviewers of the Oregon site was a nurse practitioner who taught nurse practitioners at the graduate school level, who said in 33 years of practice in Oregon, she was never aware of what family rights were, and just validated that most professionals and the populace share the ignorance. We go to the next slide. So what using Lee Webster's model, the state-specific sites have is downloadable PDFs that can be handed to any of the professionals that you see listed here. And the burgeoning field of death or end-of-life doulas, death midwives, can play a critical role as well in helping to make sure this information is physically available at the intersection with these other helping professionals, if that's what the family wants to advocate. So you can take a look at these on any of the state-specific sites and think about adapting them for your own community. Let's go to the next slide. So there really are kind of four basic practices that can help to break down the default that for many families will leave them with regrets. And the first is, instead of saying, what funeral home do you plan to use? What funeral home would you like to use? You can ask a broader question. How can we assist you with funeral plans? And for most hospice and care facilities, they won't recommend any one provider. So they'll have a sheet listing all of the funeral homes in the area. And a non-commercial site like this can be added to that sheet so that people have another source of non-commercial information. There are also a variety of policies in place, hospital release policies, body release policies that have nothing to do with state law. State law may be completely neutral about families bringing their dead home. As we said, it's legal in every state. But if the hospital won't release the body without a paid funeral professional, then you're going to have to be paying probably thousands of dollars for that to happen. And then lastly, in-service education, we do it whenever we get a chance. So let's look at the next slide, and I'll just give you an example of 2 hospital systems in Oregon that amended their list of funeral homes to include Oregon Funeral Resources and Education, and even to retitle funeral homes and after-death resources. So it is possible to open this up. And then on the next slide, really the biggest victory for Kelia was winning a change in the body release policy of the hospital that had not been able to release her son. And if you look at the fine print, it says release for home burial. Again, it has nothing to do with the disposition of the body. It has to do with the family's right to be able to transport and have custody of their own family. And on the next slide, just as we wrap up, we had the entire contents of the site vetted by the state medical examiner, who acknowledged that his deputy in Kelia's county, the county where her son was taken to hospital, had made an error and invited us to participate in revising the in-service training for the deputy medical examiners that's done every year. And you can see him affirming that this type of website is a good resource for families as well as for investigators, for death investigators. Many people out there are just legitimately unaware of this option that families have, and he vowed that they would continue to include this in their yearly death educator course to further minimize the chances of future miscommunication about families' rights. And on the next slide, you can see, thanks. In Washington State, the efforts that we undertook, shall I just highlight
Yeah.
this, Jody? With the anticipation of publishing Washington Funeral Resources and Education, we realized that with the electronic death registration system, there was actually no way for families to access their legal right to file the death paperwork on their own without hiring a funeral director to do so. We brought that to the State Department of Health, their Vital Center for Health Statistics, and they said, oh no, families can do this on their own. And we said, well, where would they find that information? And they produced this PDF and they put it up on their website. And so again, it's that squeaky wheel to help both repopulate the imagination of what's possible and to counter the default practices that have become so embedded that deprive many families of the opportunity to do this. Next slide. So we know we're not going to get to so many of these questions, but I do want to speak to one person's question about what if you don't have people? You know, what if you don't have family? What if you don't have community? And both Jody and I have worked with so many folks for whom that is the case. And that's where the community death care model that is taking hold in many communities is so important, to find ways to extend this care to people that don't have them. Have it to even creating places for people to die if they don't have a home, and to work with a place that actually has, as Jody described, a home team, and to have those conversations. Sometimes it's, you know, a nephew that you don't think would be interested in helping with this, but it could be life-changing for that nephew to be able to have the chance to be brought into the connection with the bigger picture in this way. So let's go to the next slide, and Jody, let you speak to just recapping anything else here. Again, we want to show you these resources, and on the next slide, where you find those state-by-state funeral requirements. And on the next slide. Jody, you want to speak to how people can learn more about?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This is a great comprehensive list on the New Hampshire site, and then they have bulleted which ones are certified through the Green Burial Council. The next slide is a couple of screenshots from Green Burial Council website itself. I send people to this map all the time, as a way of, because I'm often getting folks who are not in Washington but don't have a natural burial ground near them either, and so it might be worth it to them to come all the way to Washington, but they need to figure out how to get there. So the certification model is really beautiful for like best practices and standards and transparency, but there are more and more cemeteries, sometimes they're old pioneer cemeteries, that are beginning to uh, bury people the way they used to back in the day. Sometimes they're still in relationship with vault suppliers, and like it's a wild west out there right now, I feel like, um but beginning to do some research around this, if green burial is the thing that resonates in your heart, I think is uh better. Yeah, what I was saying before around grief and logistics, those two things are not actually very good friends. And so as much as you can let friends and family know what you would like, the better they can honor your wishes. And back to that idea of maybe your nephew needs to grieve in a really useful way by making something, or by driving, or by lifting. Like there are models of grieving that are oriented through our words, and then there are a lot of ways of grieving that are not verbal, that are more of the being of use. So
Mm.
don't assume necessarily just because somebody can't talk about it that they can't be of use.
So thank you all so much for your beautiful attention and your questions. I hope we've given you some next steps in terms of where you can pursue those questions further, even though we weren't able to answer them. And before we turn it back over to Stephanie to close, I just want to lift up Kelia's words again. You could be the person in the room to say, I think you can.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much, Holly and Jody. If you get a chance to go back and read over all of the wonderful comments people are sharing about you both in the chat, please do, because you are getting so much praise for this wonderful presentation. To answer the multitude of questions, yes, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted publicly to the Green Burial Council's website, and to our YouTube page. So share it broadly with your friends and family. While you're there, maybe make a donation to the Green Burial Council's website. We are a nonprofit. This is a free event. We want to keep these events free and open to the public. So anything you donate will go right back into paying for our Zoom account, things like that. So with that, I'm gonna wrap it up. There weren't a ton of questions in the chat, and Holly, I think you were keeping a pretty good eye on them and answering them kind of as they came. But definitely check out the websites. And I will leave it there. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.